This is Professor Ann Orion Spieher from the University of Alaska Southeast, and this is a lecture on ends, means, the spectrum, and policy, Chapter 2 from Ecological Economics, Principles and Applications. Again, this is Chapter 3, Part 2, and here what we'll show is how this ends-means duality impacts policy and that there are three possible strategies for integrating ecology and economics. We will also show which strategy equates with the traditional economic models, and we will show which model we will be using in this course. Let's begin by reviewing the ends, means, and then begin the discussion of the ends, means spectrum in the middle. This graph is a good illustration of what we mean. We will begin with the top, the ultimate end. Although we struggled to define the ultimate end without violating democracy, we suggested a working definition of the ultimate end for which an ecological economy may strive toward. That is, the maintenance of ecological life support systems far from the edge of collapse and healthy, satisfied human populations free to work together in the pursuit and clarification of a still vague ultimate end for a very long time. And it is important to note that this end does assume and requires an end to exponential material growth in the economy. What has been defined as the goal of ecological economics is clearly an ethical, religious, or philosophical goal. And this is the weakness of this approach, as typically economists have left these kinds of issues to the normative fields of economics. We consider these types of goals to be normative goals. And these types of normative goals are typically left to the fields or disciplines of philosophy, religion, and ethics. Our only goal in traditional economics has been to achieve a Pareto social welfare where everybody is better off without making anybody else worse off. So this is the weakness of the model, as it is in essence broadening the scope of economics and thus reducing the level of abstraction in our model. We are including, in essence, an additional discipline. In addition, by addressing ethics, we are requiring normative assignment of our goals. But we have fully explained why we have taken this step. There are just too many negative consequences of ignoring these issues within the field of economics. Now, granted, it was much easier when economic thought began in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when we all lived in an empty world. But in a full world view, ignoring ethics could have catastrophic consequences. Note that by ignoring ethics and the top of this diagram and defining the scope of economic models to reside only within the middle, within the ends, means spectrum, we could say that economics has become too materialistic, as it has avoided ethical issues of things like unequal income distribution or even the consequences of continued exponential economic growth, and has equated a better, more meaningful life as one with more material stuff. Our models have become too materialistic because economists traditionally take the solution to the ethical problem as given and start their analysis with a given ranking of intermediate ends, or with the assumption that one person's ranking is just as good as another's, so that ethics is indistinguishable from personal subjective tastes, and that these tastes are revealed by consumption patterns. Now let's consider the bottom of our diagram, where once again we have expanded our model to include the biophysical or physics in an effort to include the natural global ecosystem's limitations of continued economic growth. We defined the ultimate means at the bottom of the spectrum as a common denominator of possibility or usefulness that cannot be produced, for which we are totally dependent on the natural environment. Now, note again that ignoring the top of the diagram, ethical issues, our economic models became too materialistic. But now, by ignoring the bottom of the diagram, our economic models will become not materialistic enough. It means that if one considers the bottom, where the laws of thermodynamics and the natural environment reside, and remove this from our economic models, our models, in a sense, will become not materialistic enough. So when economists ignore the top and approximate ethical goals with just more economic growth, the models become too materialistic. Yet, when economists ignore the bottom of the diagram, where the useful low-entropy matter energy that cannot be replenished or created, and where the technical and biophysical problems reside, and for which the economy is dependent on for production, we find that economic models are not materialistic enough. And this is really it in a nutshell. Economics has roots in both the physical and the moral spheres. This is what is meant by the ends-means dualism. Ecological economics embraces a practical dualism where the material and the spiritual or ethical realms interact. Now let's discuss the middle. This is called the ends-means spectrum. This ends-means spectrum itself is the middle where economic value is determined. In everyday life, it is our mid-range where the ends and means interact. It is where our practical dualism interacts, in the middle of the diagram where the ends-means spectrum resides. We will discuss this intermediate mid-spectrum interaction in our consideration of the function of the markets and relative prices on the chapter in the chapter on microeconomics. Here, the economic choices that exist in this middle where the ends and means interact are not completely determined by the material limitations from below, nor are they made meaningless without well-defined ethical definitions from above. This is one reason why economics has been a successful discipline up till now. When these issues are subdivided into the disciplines of physics, economics, and ethics or philosophy, analysis does become much easier. This is why disciplines abstract in the first place when creating their models, to simplify analysis and to allow for more tractable, less complicated models. To expand the definition of economics to use our new definition of economics as using the ultimate means efficiently and wisely in the service of ultimate ends, this definition has the potential to create models that are simply intractable. But we live in a full world now. The middle-range nature of the economic problems of today are significant. If we continue to ignore ethics and the biosphere in an effort to focus on what might be tractable, the consequences for the global ecosystem and the well-being of future generations could be dire. Now let's begin discussing the three strategies for integrating ecology and economics. Ultimately, to integrate ecology and economics requires some way to first determine the ultimate ends and then some way to prioritize the ends in such a way as to avoid autocracies requiring us to forego our democracy. Well, there are three such ways of approaching this problem of integration of economics with ecology. We'll begin with economic imperialism and then discuss ecological reductionism and finally the steady-state subsystem. The first approach is to avoid the problem of integration altogether. This is the neoclassical approach, and we will call it economic imperialism. It's represented in yellow in this diagram. This approach expands the economic subsystem until it basically just encompasses the entire ecosystem. The goal is one system, the macroeconomy as the whole, and this is accomplished by internalization of all external costs and benefit that occur from production, and thereby is able to force a market price onto the external costs. This is very difficult to do in practice. We call this approach addressing externalities due to the market failure of goods that cannot be valued on the market. And it requires shadow prices of public goods to be determined. Economists attempt to sum all subjective individual preferences and take this to be the source of all valuation. The irony of this approach is that economic imperialism, it ultimately ends out becoming a centrally planned economy. The other approach by the economic imperialist model is to privatize all commodities, assigning all ownership and control to private individuals who make all the decisions about preserving the environmental resources, to profit-oriented private owners. The privatization approach to conserving social goods, such as the commons, ultimately requires, again, autocratic control of the commons. We will discuss this much more in the chapters on microeconomics. Again, this approach is called the economic imperialist approach and is basically the neoclassical economic approach. Ecological reductionism, the second approach represented in blue here, begins with the great assumption that even humans are not exempt from the laws of nature. But then it proceeds to the conclusion that human action is totally explainable by and completely reducible to all the laws of nature. This approach relies too heavily on the laws of physics and biology, while at the same time erasing all the boundaries, all the social boundaries, of all the social sciences. Ecological reductionism seeks to replace the economic models by naturalistic principles that apply to the ecosystem. It removes the economic boundaries altogether. As Daly and Farley, our textbook authors, put it, taken to the extreme in this view, energy flows, embodied energy costs, and relative prices in markets are all explained by a mechanistic system that has no room for purpose or will. This may be a sensible vision from which to study some natural systems, but if one adopts it for studying the human economy, one is stuck from the beginning with the important policy implication that policy makes no difference. We encounter once again all the problems of determinism and nihilism." Unquote. This is a form of determinism which rules out free will and assumes that our purposes cannot alter the rules of a strictly physical, material, causative world. Or worse, nihilism that assumes the rejection of all moral values. Nihilism, it is argued, is the ethical consequence of the determinist cosmology. So in this class, what we're going to do is that our focus will be on the steady-state subsystem. Let's talk about it next. This remaining strategy, steady-state subsystem, will be the focus in this course, denoted here as the green alternative. This subsystem does not attempt to eliminate the subsystem boundary, either by expanding or replacing the entire whole system, or by reducing the boundary to nothing at all. In the steady-state model, where the boundary is drawn is of utmost importance. This model suggests that the economic boundary in the economy has an optimum, and importantly, that the throughput by which the ecosystem maintains and replenishes the economic subsystem must be ecologically sustainable. Once the boundary of an optimal size is established, then the economic subsystem will be further divided into regions, where the market is most effective at allocating resources, and regions where it is inappropriate, where we find, for example, market failures. These regions will be defined and determined by the inherent characteristics or attributes of goods. We will discuss this in length in the remainder of this course. So in sum, the three characteristics of this steady-state subsystem is that the scale of the economy, defined by the boundary with the ecosystem that sustains it, has an optimum. And again, we assume that the throughput must be ecologically sustainable. And finally, we note again that we will subdivide the economic subsystem into regions where the market is effective at efficiently allocating resources, and regions where the market is ineffective and inappropriate. So the main idea of a steady-state economy is to maintain constant stocks of wealth and people at levels that are sufficient for a long and good life. The throughput by which these stocks are maintained should be low rather than high, and always within the regenerative and absorptive capacities of the ecosystem. And finally, the path of progress in the steady state is no longer to get bigger, but to get better. This concept was a part of classical economics, but unfortunately was more or less abandoned by the neoclassical economic approach. More precisely, the terms stationary and steady state were redefined to refer not to constant population and capital stocks as we do now, but to their proportional growth, a constant ratio between ever-growing stocks of people and things. And this is what we hope to return to in this class. This completes our discussion. I leave you with a question to ponder and a few big ideas to remember. Until later, God willing, Professor Spihar.